Well, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the first of a line of presentations by a very well-traveled, well-educated gentleman. And it is a very timely topic as well. We did it on the evening before Russia, I'm sure, as you're aware, because we lose an hour tonight, but he's got so much information. By that I mean we have to set our clocks and watches forward before you go to sleep. But he's got so much information to convey. Oh, thank you very much, sir. That it is the perfect time to talk about Russia the night before we arrive in St. Petersburg. As I mentioned, he is a very educated man. He's got a great deal of information to convey. He is quite a nice gentleman off stage as well. He has done this on several cruise ships, in particular with Oceania many times. Always nice to have him back, as his parole has just come up. So it's good to see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, your wonderful enrichment lecturer, Mr. Harry Chittick.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Yeah, my parole came up from the gulag for anti-czarist activity. I'm a lot older than I look. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. It's not your basic history course. Give you a quick little thumbnail sketch of my background. I spent most of my working career as a journalist. I know, don't talk about it. Mostly for ABC Network News. I started out as an international relations major with an idea that I was going to go into foreign service work. But along the line, I met a particular gentleman we're going to talk about tonight, and he changed my life a little bit. In fact, he changed it a lot, and it pointed me towards journalism. And then I began a career that had me involved quite a bit with revolutions. Many of them in Latin America, a number of wars, that sort of thing. I worked as a producer primarily. I worked on shows like Nightline, Good Morning America, World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, and a number of shows like that. And that took me around the world to see a lot of things. But one of my focuses has always been military and revolution and political change. So today we're going to talk about 1917, an amazing year in this part of the world, certainly in Russia, as it was around the world with World War I going on. But in particular, Russian history is most unusual. We could spend the next 3 years just studying Russia. I think Churchill's line that it was, paraphrase a bit here, a puzzle inside a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Russian history is a history of revolution, constant revolution, and it continues to this day. We've been through, just in the recent past, 2 different revolutions in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, FSU as it's called, and that changed things again here in Russia. And it's the kind of thing that's been very typical throughout their history. Quite often it's violent. They are people that are very difficult to get inside the head to understand the political processes that they use. So tonight I'm not going to take you through dates and events and times and that sort of thing, but I'm going to try to give you an overview and a feel for the year, so that the revolution that got going in the Soviet Union, or in Russia at the time, actually was a series of revolutions. And we're going to talk about those, so that tomorrow when you go out into St. Petersburg, also known as Petrograd, also known as Leningrad, thank you very much. Okay, there will not be a test. And if I decide to give a blue book later on, it'll be open computer. But no internet. Okay. So, I'm not going to ask you to remember a lot of things. Some of it will be a little bit complicated. I'm on the ship here for the whole cruise. I'm delighted to sit and answer questions and talk with you on any number of subjects that I'm going to go over. And we've got a wide variety of subjects I'm going to talk about. From the Russian Revolution, which is kind of our most serious talk, we're going to also go in and talk about the Monuments Men a little bit later in the cruise. How many of you know what the Monuments Men were? Not that many. Oh, good. So you won't be bored by my talk. There's a group of 300 men and women who, during the last days of World War II, raced across Europe on the heels of the Allied Army and rescued all of the art that had been looted, millions of pieces of art that had been looted by the Nazis, and saved them for civilization. So we'll talk about them. We're also going to go back a little bit in time and talk about the Zeppelins, which were the cruise liners of the sky. About the number of passengers that you have in this room is about a little bit less than this was what traveled in those great airships across the oceans for 37 years and carried tens of thousands of passengers without incident until that terrible day at Lakehurst. So we'll talk about that. And I've got a little bit of a mystery for you to learn about Marconi and the Crippen case in 1910 and the first ever cop chase followed by the public, and that was across the ocean. We'll talk about that. Murder most foul on the high seas. And finally, oh yeah, because I'm based in Los Angeles. Yeah, all right. We're going to talk about Hollywood scandals. Yeah, well, probably even have a bigger house than we do for the revolution because everybody loves a good scandal. And we'll talk about some of the more famous ones from Hollywood. So let's talk about Russia and let's get into this. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and I'm delighted to, if you want to ask questions, ask tough ones. And if I don't know the answer, I'll do my best to get an answer for you. Thank you very much, Internet. So I've told you about my background. The gentleman that I met in my senior year at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University is named Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky was the prime minister and the head of the provisional government that bridged between the Tsar and Lenin and the communists. And I actually spent a whole semester in a seminar with him, 12 of us, and were able to ask him questions like, what was Lenin like? And what was Trotsky like? And what was Stalin like? And what did the Tsar say to you? That's a rare thing to have happen, to be able to actually talk to an eyewitness participant in a major historical event. And that's what set me on my course of following historic events and following changing history, so that I owe a lot to what happened in my life to that gentleman, and we're going to talk a lot about him. Russia is like a barrel of crabs, someone once said, because anytime one crab starts to crawl out of the barrel, all the other crabs reach up and tear him to shreds. And in a sense, that kind of describes how Russian politics work. We're going to talk about a chain of events that started in about 1900. There were many events before that, but we haven't got time to go into those. So what I'd like to do is point out that over the last 90 years, 80 years, the then communist governments from the Bolsheviks on made it a point to create an image of the Russian Revolution. Sergei Eisenstein made several films about it, very dramatic, very exciting. We've all seen the scenes of the storming of the Winter Palace with people with guns firing and armored cars and tanks. It never happened that way. And many of the events that we think of when we hear the October Revolution were fabricated, created, or embellished by the propaganda arms of the Bolsheviks, and then who became the communists, and on through Stalin and on up until the very recent past. You saw how that ended when the cult of Leninism was destroyed in Glasnost and Perestroika in the last decade or so, where they tore down the statues of Lenin. Well, in that process, the current Soviet governments opened up their archives that up to this point had been very secret. They were closely held state secrets of what had actually happened. So researchers from around the world have been able to go to Moscow and to St. Petersburg and delve into the secret police files and look into the Tsar's files and look into the Communist Party's files and the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and the Cadets and the Social Revolutionary Workers' Party and all of that mass of political units that evolved and came into being during the revolution. And what they've turned up is a much more different story, a much more human story, and how really closely run this was. The Russian Revolution succeeded not because, as they'd like to create the image, it was unstoppable, unavoidable, and the popular will. It never worked that way. It was put together with spit and luck and opportunity and blind stepping into it and suddenly going, oh, this might work, and trying things out, and out of that came modern-day Russia, or the Russia that we knew most of our lives. But to start this story, we have to go back in time a little bit. Back to the time of Tsar Nicholas. We'll start our story in 1894 with the coronation of Tsar Nicholas Romanov. He was the Nicholas II, and the coronation took place right where we're going to be tomorrow in St. Petersburg. It was called St. Petersburg, but at the very same time, it was also called Petrograd. And it wasn't something that was created artificially. It's a very common thing to have a series of names for city in Russia. And so I'll refer to it both as Petrograd and as St. Petersburg. So the Romanovs had ruled Russia since 1613. That's a pretty good run. They were the second and final dynasty to rule Russia. His forebears had expanded the borders so that he inherited an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Baltic, from Europe to Asia, from the Black Sea to the Arctic Circle, and contained more than 100 different languages and dialects. You can imagine the difficulty of ruling and administering a country of this size. The imperial rule was autocratic and absolute. It was conservative. It did not handle change. There was no mechanism for change, and so it had become very stultified. At the same time, Russia was very backward. Imagine that the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, certainly, and in North America and a few other places around the world, really got started in the mid-1800s, and by 1900 was going full blast. We were only a couple of years away from airplanes. Cars were already there, telephones, a lot of technology was coming in the factory, a whole industry. The industrialization of agrarian countries had already taken place. In Russia, it hadn't. There were almost no factories in 1900. There was very little in the way of unions. Primarily 80% of the people in Russia at that time were agrarian, were peasants, tied to the land, not exactly still serfs, but not very far from it. They were basically shackled to the land, working as tenant farmers, or at best as hired farmers by a bloated aristocracy that owned almost all of the land. So let's meet this royal family and some of the characters here. There he is, Nicky, as Queen Victoria called him. He was her grandson by marriage. That's his wife, Alexandra. She was known as the German princess. She came from a German family from the Saxe-Coburg line, and as such, she was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So as you know, the royal families there were all kind of commingled and intermarried. She also carried the hemophilia gene, as did so many of the royal families of Europe. And that was to play another critical part in our story as we move along. Their love, the next Tsar, young Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov of Russia, he was destined to become the next Tsar after his father, Nicholas. And he was a hemophiliac, and there was a great deal of doubt as to whether or not he would survive into adulthood. As probably you all know, hemophilia is if you cut and you start to bleed, it's almost impossible to stop the blood, to clot it. And so they're very likely to bleed to death, usually from an internal problem. So that occupied much of the family's time. Neither Nicholas nor Alexandra really wanted to be the rulers. They enjoyed the trappings. They enjoyed the life of a very wealthy family in Russia, of aristocracy. But as rulers, they both had said even before their fall that they would much prefer to have been private citizens. Then there were the Grand Duchesses, their daughters, who had all preceded the young Tsarevich. And there they are. That's Olga on the left, Tatiana next to her, Maria next to her, and Anastasia on the right. And we all know Anastasia Romanov and the legends that surrounded her. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Under autocracy, and the autocracy of Nicholas II, Russia was not only backwards, but extremely conservative. It was resistant to change. The crown was resistant to change. The bureaucracy was resistant to change. It was done this way, and there was no method to get it to change. So any protest was ruthlessly put down. There had been reforms initiated by various czars over the preceding 100 years, a realignment of the serfs, a recognition that some things had to change. But really underlying all of this was the aristocratic class that owned all of the land, owned everything, and they weren't about to let it go. They felt that Russia's long history of revolution would continue until something were to change it. But growing within Russia, as it was across Europe, was the specter of socialism. This was something new, Marx had written about it, Engels had written about it. Everyone was talking about it, but no government had actually accepted it yet. No government of any size at all. It was a very risky kind of thing. Communism per se was a distant theoretical concept. There were no communists per se in Russia at this time. They were socialists or socialist revolutionaries, and they thought of themselves that way. The theories of Marx and Engels were viewed as not just ideas, but hard rules, hard facts of life about the human condition. Many Russian intellectuals believed that social democracy was the way and the only hope for Russia. That would be something that would come from the middle and upper class, and that would improve the lot of the lower classes, the 80% who were not educated, who did not have a voice, did not have any organization. The Tsar, of course, disagreed with this idea, as did his court and his ruling bureaucracy. So they had the secret police which cracked down on this revolutionary concept of socialism and social democracy. And what is that all about? Well, we don't know, but get rid of them. So the secret police was massive, and it cracked down, and from about 1900 on had sent a wave of immigrés, they were called. They believed, and the Russians believed, that a forced exile, a banishment from Russia, was the worst punishment. Get them out of our hair. We don't have to kill them and deal with the anger. Let's just push them across. So some of you probably remember in your youth hearing your grandparents or even your parents talk about the Russian immigrant population. New York was one of the centers of this. And that added to the wave of refugees that were leaving Russia as a result of the pogroms and other activities that made life in Russia untenable. So you had two layers of people being pushed out of Russia or leaving Russia. Most of those who were liberal, who wanted change, ended up in Western Europe, and there were, in Zurich especially, there was a very large colony of very active Russian socialists. In the 1890s, the Russian government had launched a major drive to catch up with the rest of the world and industrialize the country. Capitalism did come to Russia, though very late in a very limited form, and Marx's analysis increasingly seemed to be more relevant to changing Russian conditions. His analysis was, and we're not going to go into a whole theory about socialism and communism, again that would take a couple of years of work to get into it deeply, but the basic tenet was that countries went through three stages. They started with capitalism, and you had to have capitalism so that you could build a middle class, so that you could build a body of people that became educated enough to understand how they were oppressed. And then Marx said you went from that stage to the stage of socialism, which is when the workers would take over their lives, begin to be inserted into it and become a little bit more active and a little bit more revolutionary. And from socialism, that would lead to what he called communism, but that was a theoretical where there was no government. The idea of communism in its theoretical form is everyone gets according to their needs, and you don't have to do anything other than exist. Well, everyone felt, okay, you've got to be capitalist first, and then you can become socialist. The problem was there was no capitalists. So even Lenin and even Engels and Trotsky and the other revolutionaries admitted and understood that they had to have capitalism before they could have socialism. No one really thought that communism could exist. It did not take into account the human mind. We'll see what happens later on, and that happened. It was, however, the Marxists who felt that Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, and that was their main socialist party, would be the vehicle by which, from 1898 on, change would come to Russia. Eventually, this Socialist Workers' Party splintered. You need to understand what happened, because we're going to talk about these people, into a whole bunch of different parties. But the two primary ones were the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And the only difference between them was their methodology. One believed in the Bolsheviks believed in violent revolution, and the Mensheviks believed in social revolution, one that was gradual and came along. So with that in mind, like a pot left on the stove for too long, things were beginning to bubble over by 1903, 1904, and 1905. By the time the very harsh winter of 1905 came on, there was beginnings of a famine. And the focus now became St. Petersburg, where most of the industrialized factories were located. Closest to Europe, ability to move supplies and product in and out. It was also the capital. It began peacefully enough with a strike by about 80,000 workers in the region. That led to a march to the Winter Palace to present their demands to the Tsar. Most workers still loved the Tsar and felt that the Tsar was stable, and if he could understand their plight, he, as the father of Russia, would take care of his children. And that was a general idea. So a peaceful march on Sunday, January the 22nd, 1905, through the streets that you will drive on tomorrow, except it was winter. The only really difference. It will look not much different than it did in 1905. Families had joined the march. It was festive because most Russians still felt that the Tsar was on their side, or at least would help them. Then the scene began to change. It was hardly revolutionary. It wasn't even threatening. They had banners, and this is an actual photograph of the march. You see children there, you see the banners and flags, but it was peaceful, and they were just going to march. Then things started to go wrong. Try to picture the scene. There's the Winter Palace, but it's January. There's about a foot of snow on the ground. The temperature is below zero. The workers and their families had all been to church that morning. And so after church and after a bite to eat, they all got together, and they're going to march to the Winter Palace singing songs. And they had a designated leader committee that was going to present to someone at the palace. And they made no secret about it. And the palace knew that they were coming. No one expected trouble. But something went wrong. A line of Cossack cavalry trots out from behind the palace out into the courtyard there, out into that giant plaza in front of the palace. The horses' hooves are scrunching in the snow. The hush begins to fall over the crowd. Nobody understands what's happening. The crowd slows to a halt. The thousands of people behind push forward to see what's going on, to see what's happening. The marchers bunch up. There are shouted questions, some threats, some raised fists. What's going on here? Are they going to attack us? Then a line of soldiers marches out in front of the cavalry, turns, and at a shouted command, they open fire. Screaming, chaos, blood splattered in the snow, bodies, people running for their lives. This is an actual photograph taken from the palace of this happening. You can see the soldiers ready to fire. You can see the crowd turning to run. When the smoke clears, somewhere around 500 people lie dead in that January snow. No one knows who gave the order to fire. No one has ever admitted to it. Everyone went, wasn't me. The number of casualties vary. If you read the Bolshevik sources, they say 2,000. If you read the palace sources, it was about 50. So most historians figure about 500. Sure, the marches stopped, the protests stopped, but the fallout from this was enormous. It was earth-shaking. It gave a cause to what had been a kind of nebulous revolutionary spirit, but there was nothing to hang it on. And now the Tsar's troops have given him something to hang it on. That wave of strikes, terrorist incidents, assassinations, bomb blasts, and peasant unrest sweeps across Russia. There's anger that the Tsar and his government had never seen before. And pretty much the active phase of the Russian Revolution is thought to have started on that bloody Sunday morning in 1905. The Tsar's crown now begins to slip a little bit. He realizes, and his court and his advisors realize that something's gone wrong and they're going to have to do something. So he reluctantly agrees to a limited constitutional monarchy, something that England had had for some time and other countries as well. But to an autocratic rule like the imperial family or the imperial rule of Russia, this was just foreign beyond belief. But he knew he had to do something. And this allowed, most importantly, the creation of a state Duma, D-U-M-A, the state Duma, which became a place where new political parties could be recognized and could operate. The idea of a parliamentary or constitutional monarchy. This will have far-reaching consequences that no one could foresee. Now, this is a picture of the meeting of the First Duma. And if that one picture was worth 1,000 words, this one's worth 1,000,000. Imagine this scene. This is in the palace. They decide they're going to have the first meeting, and the Tsar will open the session, much as the Queen today opens Parliament and has, or the King has in England's history. On the right, and we can't talk political here, it's actually as you're looking at it, on the right are the workers. The Workers' Committee and the delegates and representatives of all the parties that are clamoring to take over and become part of this Duma. Now, they have no real political power or administrative power other than as an advisory at this point to the throne. On the left is the royal court, and the Tsar and the Tsarina are just coming in and moving up to the thrones where they will declare after the opening prayers and everything that the Duma is now in session. If anything showed a split and a draw between the two sides at this period, this picture shows it with a huge gap in between. And the most telling moment of this is that night, Alexandra writes in her diary, and the exact quote was, "The workmen looked like they hated us." Well, yes, they did. But they were trying to reach a solution. And now the political parties become active, and they have an outlet for their voice, and the maneuvering to become a dominant party gets underway. The chief party that seemed to come out on top was the Social Democratic Workers' Party. And it eventually split, as I said, into the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and a host of others. I just give you some of the names, but you don't have to remember them. Give you an idea how far this had extended. There were something like 40 different parties all saying, we're representing the Russian people. The Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, the centrist party, the Cadets, which was a liberal party, the Tsarist party, which is a royalist party, the far right party, which really wanted to go to a dictatorship of the worst sort. In a way, this split in the Duma and all these various parties jockeying for power would be reflected in a very few years in a terrible civil war that took hundreds of thousands of lives and swept across Russia for 3 years. But before that, a much more horrid war was to step up and take over the world's attention. In 1914, Russia was pulled into World War I. She had not wanted to go to war. She really was much closer to the German rulers and Kaiser Wilhelm, who was a cousin, than they were to what became the Allied side. But because of Russia's agreements with the other powers, she became a participant in the war and opened a front against the Germans. The Russians entered the war totally unprepared for an extended modern weaponry conflict. The war began with a massive defeat of the 1st and 2nd Russian army by the Germans in East Prussia. At the area when we get to Warnemünde, and you all are going to Berlin in that area, you will be going through the area where these battles initially took place. The slaughter was enormous. The Russian gains were minimal, and by 1917, the Russian casualty rate, that is, those being killed, wounded, or captured, was running at just under 50% of the frontline troops. 50%. In most wars throughout the last 200 years, 15% casualties is considered almost unmanageable. To have 50% is unsustainable. Even the necessities that most soldiers needed, the Russians didn't have. They didn't have enough rifles, so soldiers were sent into combat with nothing but a sword against machine guns and modern artillery fire. It was a slaughter. Even the